is the final assessment video for EDF1304. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about assessment task 2, and I'm talking about the essay. Obviously we've already done the presentation, which will hopefully have given you some general ideas and some feedback so that you can then place all of that feedback, all of your ideas, and put this in the essay. But I just want to kind of go through the rubric with you so you understand exactly what you are going to be marked on. So the idea of this assessment is to obviously to analyze a case study, a teaching video, and critique the teaching and the learning within that video. So let's look at the rubric. The first criteria 1, it says an introduction that states the purpose of this assignment, including a definition of teaching as supported by readings and additional literature. Now there's two kind of main things there. First of all, it talks about in an introduction. Now, some of you will have learned about introductions, and we did talk a little bit about this in EDF1304. And some of you think of an introduction as that general sort of thing of where you have a hook or a general statement, then you give some information about that, and then you have a thesis statement. And that's very much kind of like this, but the main part is that it introduces the topic and states the purpose, and that's basically a thesis statement. So in other words, of course this is off the top of my head, but something to the effect of, in this essay, so what are you going to do? In this essay, I will first define teaching, then I will summarize the case study on maybe Jamie's dream lesson, and finally I will analyze and critically reflect on the teaching in this video that encourages learning. Something to that extent. So you're actually kind of giving a roadmap. I like to call it a roadmap, saying to your readers, this is the purpose of this essay. This is what I'm going to do. And it just gives kind of a sense of organization. So when we say a purpose statement, that's what we're saying. What are you going to do in this assignment? So a way to do that is to look at the rubric and say, well, I need to do this, I need to do this, and I need to do that. So I need to define teaching, I need to summarize the case study, and I need to analyze it and then reflect on, what are the implications for teaching and learning. So that introduction, first you're giving that thesis statement, the purpose. What are you going to talk about in this essay? The next part says including a definition of teaching as supported by readings and additional literature. Now, when we talk about definition of teaching, it's very similar to what we talked about in regards to a definition of curriculum. Now, obviously, there's not just one hard definition of teaching, but what you need to think of is discussing teaching. And I use the word synthesize, and we talk about synthesis, particularly in Bloom's. We talk about, you can list definitions or you can synthesize, and that shows this higher order kind of thinking. So what we're really looking at is not a list of definitions. So-and-so says that teaching is this, so-and-so says that teaching is this, and so-and-so says that teaching is this. But it's saying, well, while Barnes and Gendidis argue that teaching is others believe that teaching includes . So it shows that you're not just listing definitions, but you actually can see the similarities and the differences, and you can look and you can pull them apart and put them together. So that's what we're looking at. Some of you may at the end want to say, from all of these definitions, I think for myself, a very kind of defining way to look at teaching is this. Now it says supported by readings and additional literature. Now you have your readings as in your textbook, but additional literature is looking at peer-reviewed articles. And one of the tutorial tasks looked at, how do you find peer-reviewed articles? So looking at and searching for, teaching that talks about teaching, pedagogy, so on. So you need to get that additional literature. Now, often people say, well, how many do you have to have? Well, we don't necessarily, I don't think we have anywhere stated that there's a certain number, but I'd be thinking, the more, to be able to kind of say it's supported by, particularly when in an HD it says strong support. Well, what is strong support? It's going to have multiple kind of support from additional literature and articles. So if you're looking for a D or an HD, you're going to have to be looking outside of the readings and providing that additional support to say I've read widely, and I actually can define and kind of pull apart this idea of teaching because I've looked widely. Okay, Criteria 2, summary of the case study from the video, providing a concise description of the case study, who, what, where, when, why. Now those keywords are just kind of, you don't necessarily have to talk about each one, but they're helpful. And it's much easier as a marker to be able to say, yes, they did talk about all of these different things. So be careful with, don't generally describe it. I think in the presentations I found that some people would kind of generally describe the case study, but it was almost as if there was an assumption that everybody knew what you were talking about. So describe the case study as if you're telling someone about the video. You're giving the context. So who are the students? Who is the teacher? Where is it at? You're giving that contextual information, but you're also giving a description of what's happening as if they have not watched the video. I think that's really important. So I could actually read it and say, I don't need to watch the video. I actually have a sense of what it's about. And that idea of, who and what, in Jamie's video, there were some great presentations that really, they took that extra step to look at, who were the students, how many were there, and that sort of thing. So I think that contextual information is important. Try to avoid doing things like who and then just writing out a few dot points or a sentence about it. What, doing that. But write this within sentences in a paragraph, a conversation, instead of just listing out who, what, where, when, why. In the question section, people were saying, well, why isn't that an analysis? And yes, you might have a sentence to say, well, why the purpose of this lesson is this, which will be analyzed, and how effective the teacher was in, encouraging the students to learn this particular topic or idea. So that why can actually be a good linking. You might just briefly talk about, because it's saying concise. We're not writing pages and pages. This is only 20% of your grade. So you don't want to go overboard on the summary and then not have enough to actually give the analysis, which is a much higher percentage in regards to the marks. So just use that as a link. You don't need to go into a lot of detail of the why, but then bring it back to the analysis. So the analysis, this is worth 40%. So this is where you want to spend a lot of your time. So analysis of the case study that critically discusses how teaching takes place to encourage learning. The discussion defines and explains the theory specific to the case study. The discussion is supported by key readings of literature. So there's a couple of things here. So the analysis and critical discussion, not a summary of events. So this isn't, the summary of what's happened, but it's looking at, in some ways that you might do that is you might focus on kind of 3 main things that you saw, 2 or 3 main things. Only if you can do the 2 in real depth, but it's better to do more depth than breadth. So let's say, just for example, you organize it in a way of, well, the teacher used group work or collaborative learning, and they also use really high quality questioning or questions. Okay, so those, I'm just giving 2 for example. And so that's kind of how you organize, and that's where you say, well, did these different strategies, the way that the teacher incorporated collaborative or group work or collaborative learning, did that encourage learning, and how do I see that? What were they doing? So I might look at the theories in regards to that, and support kind of the use of collaborative groups. Talk about the theory, use those peer-reviewed articles to talk about, how useful collaborative learning is, or cooperative learning, and use that theory, use those articles to support your discussion, but also use examples. So giving specific examples, because again, you can't assume that your reader understands what you're talking about. So give a specific example. So you might say, I'm looking at, one of the things that in the video the teacher did was use higher order questions. So you're linking this to Bloom. So one of the presentations I heard did a fantastic job of, not only when they were talking about how the teacher used questions, they actually analyzed the questions that the teacher was using based on Bloom's taxonomy. What a fantastic analysis. That is the kind of stuff where that is critical. That is a critical analysis and discussion by looking at those questions that they use and connecting it to Bloom. So, what is Bloom's taxonomy? What sorts of questions was the teacher using, and what kind of learning was this actually encouraging? So that's the kind of critical analysis and discussion that we're looking for. It's going that depth to give examples, to connect it to the theories and the reading, and again, that peer-reviewed articles, and really going in deep there, instead of just saying, well, the teacher did this, 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 and this, and this is how it encouraged learning, but really going deep, connecting it to theory, connecting it to outside articles, but also your reading, that's fine, and going into depth. The last criteria is criteria 4. Of course, we have the literacy, the language and the literacy, but this is kind of the content sections. So criteria 4 is a conclusion that summarizes the key aspects of teaching and learning from your discussion and analysis of the case study. And also a brief reflection of the implications for future teaching is considered. So there's 2 things here. So when we talk about a conclusion that summarizes, we're looking at something that summarizes the key points. So if you were talking about the teacher's use of cooperative or collaborative learning and the use of higher order questioning, you're probably going to say something to the effect of, this essay looked at, various definitions of teaching, and summarize this case study and really analyze the use of cooperative and collaborative group work as well as higher order questioning. So you're summarizing what were those key points that you talked about and recapping the purpose of the essay. But then the second part is not just kind of summarizing these main aspects that you've discussed, but then that part of, and a lot of times last year people forgot this section, but reflecting on how your newfound understanding impacts your future teaching. So maybe you found that the teacher used this particular type of questioning, and you think, I really want to explore in my own teaching the use of these higher order questions. Or you may have found, and it doesn't have to be all great things, you could say, well, the teacher, one of the presentations that I watched talked about how the teacher didn't give enough time for the students to process the information. She'd ask a question and then the students didn't have actually enough time to answer, or put them in groups, but they didn't actually have enough time to do the activity. So looking at kind of, now that you have learned things through this, or you've watched this video, what sorts of things can you now then implement in your own teaching? How does this actually affect your own teaching? And in this section, it's okay to use I, because you're reflecting on your own kind of thoughts in regards to teaching and how your teaching might change based on what you've learned from this video. Finally, but definitely not least of all, is the literacy and language sections. Now just remember, there's some of you will not spend the time, I would suggest that you finish the paper and you give a few days to kind of then look at it one more time to make sure that you haven't made any typos or so on, and go to the library, ask the language advisor, the literacy, and I think actually it's the library skills advisor, I'm not quite sure what the title is, but go and ask them they do these drop-in sessions and ask them to give you some feedback. Also make sure with your referencing, just check alongside, have the APA guide next to you, make sure you're checking to make sure that you're using referencing correctly. The last little kind of pointer that I'll give you is to ensure that this is due after, for some of you who are going to placement. I know HP isn't going on placement, but for those who are going on placement, I would suggest that you try to get this in sooner rather than later, maybe even before you go on placement, because as soon as you get back from placement, the presentation will have been several weeks past, and all of this information is kind of, in the distance. So act on it now, get this done, and then once you go on placement, you are finished with this unit. That's my little piece of advice. Anyway, again, it's been lovely to get to know you this year, and I wish you all the best in the next year.